For me, this is a different chair I'm sitting in now for the past 7 or 8 months than the chair I was in before. So I've had a pretty unique opportunity to see compliance literally from both sides of the table. And in getting started, I thought maybe the first thing to do was to kind of to go over the enforcement process and how it works in general, and then talk a little bit about what's happened during COVID. I know we probably all seen there's been some EPA memorandums and some MDEQ memorandums dealing with how COVID, how the agencies are treating COVID-related issues. So with that, the enforcement process in general, what most people are going to see is, an inspection. MDEQ inspectors are going to show up, EPA inspectors are going to show up, and they're going to inspect the facility. One thing to note in that at the inspection, when the agency does, or personnel does come to your facility, certainly safety briefings and how you treat anybody else that's coming into the facility, you can require obviously the same thing for agency personnel. So that's just something to know. You've got to give them reasonable access to the facility, but that doesn't mean that safety protocols, them sitting through the safety briefings, you should continue to do that with the agency personnel like you would with anyone else. So you go through the facility, the inspector completes his inspection, he heads back to MDEQ or EPA, and then at some point later, if there were issues that were discovered during the inspection, you're going to receive an NOV, a notice of violation. From a timing perspective, that could be anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 weeks, probably normally after the inspection takes place. And then that NOV is going to list out what the alleged violations were that were discovered during the inspection. It's also, the NOV will also set up a time for an administrative conference with the agency. And at that administrative conference is when you'll be afforded the opportunity to come in and basically tell your side of the story. Now I realize that I'm biased when I say this, but I do think this is a good idea, notwithstanding my bias, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. When you get the NOV, I think it's a really good idea, and would recommend that you have that NOV reviewed and analyzed by an environmental attorney, because at times we're all human, and even agency personnel make mistakes, and so having somebody sit down, go through the NOV with you, and then apply whatever the regulations are that are said to be, the alleged violations, to go over that with you to try to figure out exactly, hey, are they correct on this, or are they not correct on this, or what are their mitigating circumstances associated with this particular violation. But to get your path planned out on how you're going to defend this particular violation. So that's the first thing, is I think you probably should sit down with your attorney and review and analyze the NOV. And in doing that, that'll help you prepare for the administrative conference with the agency, because at the administrative conference with the agency, that's when you're going to be presented with a settlement amount for your consideration. Now, that settlement amount that the agency, if you've been there, unfortunately, and been in an administrative conference, what happens is they slide it normally across the table and tell you, what the penalty is going to be. And note that penalty is for settlement purposes only. All right. And what that means is if you decline that, then the next step would be to go to a commission hearing on that. That is really very rare. During my tenure as executive director, I think we only had maybe 2 commission hearings in regard to penalties. So the vast majority of penalties are obviously settled at the agreed order stage, which is what would ultimately come out of the settlement negotiations. There would be an agreed order that basically has a penalty and puts you back on the path to compliance. At the administrative conference, when the agency gives you the proposed penalty amount, you may wonder, well, how's that determined? Well, state statute allows the commission, it's 49-1743, to penalize for any violation up to $25,000 per violation. So obviously, and that's on a per day basis. So I think that we all realize that when you do $25,000 per day, that number can get really high really quickly. And so from a practical aspect, the agency realizes that, hey, that's your upper end of what could happen, but that's not practicable. If a violation's been running for, if it's in a semi-annual report, or even in, say, a Title V violation, it shows up in an annual compliance report, it may have been going on for months at a time. And so when you start doing, say it was a 6-month-long exceedance at $25,000 a day, that's just not a reasonable amount to penalize for that particular action. So these penalty policies that the agency, MDEQ and EPA have, and MDEQ is basically modified and adopted EPA's penalty policies. Those penalty policies, they're supposed to help the agency to be objective and treat similar penalties or similar violations the same. Now, human nature being what it is, and humans being the ones who are applying those particular policies, there is obviously a subjective component to each of those policies. I dare say if you had two people take the same violation and apply the penalty policy, you're probably not necessarily going to get the same number at the end of the day. Again, that goes to the subjectivity that I was talking about and how things are applied in the policy itself. So those numbers that are calculated in the penalty policy obviously would be less than the $25,000 per day per violation to get you a quote unquote more reasonable penalty. There are two components to the penalty policy and in the penalties associated with. There's the gravity component, which is basically the extent of the exceedance, the harm to the environment component, and that's more of the component that is supposed to have the deterrence factor associated with it. This is the punishment aspect of the penalty. And then the other side of that is the benefit of economic non-compliance, or BEN as it's called. And benefit of economic non-compliance means that portion of the penalty, if you did not take an action that you were supposed to take, and that inaction saved you money, then the amount of money that's saved or the interest earned on that money that's saved is your benefit of economic non-compliance. And so that's important to know, because while the gravity penalty can be mitigated and reduced, the benefit of economic non-compliance can't. It is what it is. And normally EPA and both MDEQ have taken the position that the BEN amount has to be, that they can't mitigate that. So that's an important factor to consider. Now, BEN's not always applicable. The benefit of economic non-compliance is not something that happens in every scenario where there's a violation, but where it does happen, they have to apply it. Now, one thing to note on BEN, though, is let's say that, hey, you had a piece of control equipment that you should have had in place and it was going to cost $500,000. Well, if you ultimately have to put that piece of control equipment in place, then your benefit of economic non-compliance isn't $500,000. It's the interest that would be earned on that $500,000 during the period of time that you didn't have the piece of control equipment in place. So, it's a little tricky on how it's calculated, but it's normally the gravity amount of the penalty is by far larger than the benefit of economic non-compliance. So that's kind of it in a nutshell of the process that the agency goes through in calculating the penalty. Once that number is given to you at the administrative conference, you're normally afforded the opportunity, obviously at the conference, to tell your side of the story, and then after the conference, to put in writing what you believe are mitigating factors associated with it, and even to propose a counter amount for the penalty to the agency for their consideration. So it's your typical settlement scenario where there's some back and forth normally associated with that. Now, one thing to tell you, if you don't listen to anything else I've said, and I know I've rattled on a good bit, remember this. This is important. When you're going into the administrative conference, the one thing to know, if you don't know anything else, is you want to go in and you want to tell the agency what went wrong. If in fact something did go wrong, let me preface that by saying, right, if you've looked at the violation and say, yep, you know, that happened, we did that, then you want to go in and you want to tell them what went wrong. You want to be able to tell them what you did to fix it. And the third thing is you want to be able to tell them what you did to make sure it's not going to happen again. And the reason I say that, those three things, that's what the agency needs to hear, wants to hear, is because that will then, or should have, some mitigating impact on the ultimate amount of the penalty that is imposed. So learn, if you nothing else, know that what we did wrong, what we did to fix it, and what we've done to make sure it doesn't happen again. So I talked again about the commission hearing aspect of things. If you can't reach a settlement at the end of it, then you can go to a commission hearing. The amount that's at the commission hearing won't be that settlement amount. It'll be some number larger than that. So don't think that, well, if the agency's come out and said it's $100,000 to settle, we're going to go to the commission and roll the dice and it's going to be $100,000. What's going to be that $100,000 is for settlement purposes only, and that would be, if you can't reach a settlement, that's going to be withdrawn, and the agency may or may not use the penalty policy at that point when they submit it to the commission, because that penalty policy or policies are for settlement purposes only. So they can go back and look at that $25,000 a day per violation and hit you with that. Now, practically speaking, the commission's probably not going to impose, you know, a $10 million penalty on something if the initial calculation was $100,000. But it very well could be that the commission, taking everything in consideration, would impose a penalty that was higher than the initial settlement amount offered by the agency. So you've got to be careful and make sure that if you're going to go to the commission, if you can't reach a settlement, that you've contemplated that, hey, we've got a really good case and we think that the agency is wrong on this, and we're going to be able to convince the commission that we are correct. So I think that's the basic enforcement process that the agency has used and that most people have gone through. And I'm going to turn to Laura for just a second. Have I missed anything on that?
I don't think so, Gary. I think that was very thorough, but I know you're going to answer questions at the end if there's any on that process.
I think we'll certainly have some time at the end to answer some questions. Okay. Thanks, Laura. So how has this enforcement process been impacted by COVID-19? Well, like I said earlier on, there's been some memorandums that were put out both by EPA and MDEQ, and the first memorandum that came out was from EPA. It was March 26, 2020, and it was effective. It was predated, effective back to March 13, 2020. And in a nutshell, basically what that memorandum from EPA said is, look, if you're having issues related to COVID that keep you from being able to comply, we as EPA will take that into consideration. We'll, if you ask us, we'll extend some deadlines. We'll look at it from if that's needed, we'll look at it from a compliance perspective, and take that all into account. Basically, is EPA saying, look, if it's COVID related, we're going to use enforcement discretion, but you as a regulated entity have to take reasonable steps in order to ensure that it's not that it's abated as soon as possible, and that you are taking, again, reasonable steps to come back into compliance. That EPA memorandum, again dated March 26th, was in effect until August 31st, 2020. So on June 29th, EPA issued a termination memorandum and said, hey, we're canceling the COVID-19 memorandum. It's going to be, the termination is effective August the 31st. What did that mean practically? Well, it did cancel that, but EPA can still use enforcement discretion if an individual entity comes to them and shows there's non-compliance related to COVID-19. Yesterday, I talked to Mary Walker, who is EPA regional administrator, and just kind of asked her what the status of EPA was in regard to COVID. What's going on internally at the agency? What's happening in regard to enforcement from the agency's perspective? And she said, well, look, we're still basically in full telework mode in Atlanta. And so that I think the words that she uses, we're ramping back up in regard to inspections and compliance, but we're not there yet. So EPA is still, in the mode where the number of inspections that they performed, say last calendar year, 2019, that they're ahead of where they would be in 2020 because of COVID. Now, Mary did say that she anticipates there to be an enforcement priority given in 2021, where you may see even more inspections that didn't historically you've seen in any particular calendar year with EPA moving forward. But that's based on the presumption that we're past COVID at that point in time, at some point in 2021. So in addition to what EPA had put out on COVID, MDEQ has put out a couple of memorandums on COVID. Chris Wells issued a guidance letter dated April the 2nd, 2020, and it was very similar to what the EPA policy said. There was a couple of key components of the guidance document, and it was dated April the 2nd. It was effective starting March 14th, 2020. And basically, it said that compliance with regulatory requirements, that the agency will exercise enforcement discretion if the facility can provide adequate documentation that the deviation or the non-compliance was attributable to COVID-19, and that the entity took all reasonable steps to minimize the non-compliance, and that they took reasonable practical steps to return to compliance. So again, it was kind of the agency putting in writing that, hey, if you're having non-compliance related to COVID, we're going to use enforcement discretion. The other thing that the April 2nd MDEQ memorandum stated was that, hey, we're going to extend deadlines that may be attributable to, say, permit renewals or continuing education requirements, any type of deadline that may be out there that the entity was having to meet that they couldn't meet due to COVID-related issues. They're going to be extended until at least 90 days after the termination of that April the 2nd memorandum. The memorandum also allowed electronic submission of documents. In other words, while in the past MDEQ would require paper copies, maybe in addition to electronic documents, that memorandum said, hey, you can put in only electronic submission of the documents. And then finally, what it did, it authorized remote public hearings. And in fact, you may have seen some of those. I think that the agency has conducted both commission hearings virtually or remotely, and both permit board hearings. Now, currently, I think the agency is getting back to commission and permit board hearings in person. But if there's a spike up in the fall of the virus, then I anticipate them to continue to do it remotely. And also, going back to what I stated a little earlier in regard to the administrative conference on penalty or violations, the agency has by and large conducted those telephonically. And I think they, even after COVID ends, in certain cases, they're going to look to continue to do that because they found it to be efficient and effective. There's times, obviously, when you need to sit across the table and speak with someone and look them in the eye. but at other times they had found that, hey, the telephonic conference really works and is a benefit to both the regulated entity and to the agency from an efficiency standpoint. So that's what the April the 2nd memorandum did. MDQ on July the 20th issued a secondary memorandum that basically superseded and replaced the April the 2nd memorandum. And it basically laid out the same requirements, compliance with regulatory requirements. Again, if you could show it was related to COVID and you took reasonable steps to document that and then to come back into non-compliance, that stayed the same. The changes, though, were related to one, extension of deadlines. So say for permit renewals, what the July 20th memorandum said, it said, hey, 90 days after July 20th, any permit renewals that haven't been submitted that were due previously to July the 20th have to be submitted within 90 days. And by my calculations, that was October 19th. So yesterday was the day that the permit renewals needed to be submitted. The same with continuing education. The agency was going to look at that the same way as they did in the April memorandum. On the electronic submission of documents, they said, hey, you can continue to do that electronic submission, but we also want you to submit hard copies, and they have to be, the hard copies for the electronic submissions have to be submitted within 30 days of that July 20th order. So that was August the 20th. And then the July 20th memo also said that, hey, we're going to continue to have remote public hearings until sometime in the future when I guess the public health threat had passed. So how has that impacted the agency from a compliance standpoint? I initially thought, well, I assume that the number of agreed orders that have been entered to are significantly less than say calendar year 2019, and the amount of the penalty collected would be significantly less than was in 2019. And I talked to Tommy Tynes yesterday, who is the chief of the enforcement branch, and Tommy's him or his staff is who you would meet with during the administrative conference stage. And Tommy said that's really not the case. He said we've been very effective and efficient in these telephonic hearings. Our inspectors are back almost up to normal, going out and performing inspections where they were prior to COVID issues arising. And so I think that, it looks like that they're going to have basically the same amount of orders in, and the amount of penalty collected the same for 2020 as 2019. Now, that was, again, a bit surprising for me. Now, Tommy's role covers air and water violations. He doesn't cover UST, asbestos, and of course, a whole nother division. That's all in Office of Pollution Control. The Office of Geology and the Office of Land and Water Resources has separate compliance inspectors and deal with it. So it falls outside of Tommy's realm. But I found it interesting, again, that at least in regard to air and water violations in OPC, that it looks like the agency has managed COVID pretty well, and is still getting out there and performing inspections and still bringing compliance actions when they feel that it's warranted. I asked Tommy, well, the memorandums that MDQ put out, have you seen anybody use COVID as a defense? And he said no. When it's reached his point, when they're having an administrative conference, he hasn't seen any of that. And then I called Michelle Clark, and Michelle is the head of the Environmental Compliance and Enforcement Division in OPC. She took Tim Altman's place after Tim retired. And Michelle said, hey, we've seen some entities come in and use some of the provisions in those memorandums, mostly related to extensions of deadlines. but we haven't really seen anybody come in and say, hey, we couldn't comply, or we had non-compliance with, say, emission limits or something like that in regard to because of COVID. So most of it has been extensions of deadlines. While EPA has terminated their memorandum dealing with COVID, MDEQ's July 20th memorandum is still in effect. And spoke with Chris Wells yesterday, and he said that he envisions it to stay into effect until some point where, you know, the COVID is no longer an issue. So it's still out there. It still has some benefits. I mean, basically, it just puts into writing in regard to COVID that, hey, the agency can and will use enforcement discretion when it's warranted. And with that, that's basically all I have. So I'm happy, Kelly, to attempt to answer some questions if anybody has anything.
We've gotten one question so far. If a company receives a visit from MDEQ and no violations are found, will some type of letter noting no violations found be mailed to the company?
So I think that varies. I think that that's supposed to happen. That was something that we were looking at implementing while we were there, and it doesn't always. But I think that you know, if you haven't heard from MDEQ, say 6 to 8 weeks after the inspection, I would pick up the phone and call the inspector and just ask the question. Hey, you know, can you give me the status of this? Did you find any violations? Are you going to send a letter or not? Basically, I mean, obviously you do that in a nice way, but you know, that's not an unreasonable request at all, because there should be a letter that comes out saying that, hey, we've inspected the facility and no violations were found at this time.
Okay, well, it looks like that was the only question that we had. So thank you, Laura.
I'm sorry, Kelly, I didn't mean to talk over you. I just want to say thank y'all for letting us participate. And if we can be of any assistance to any of the regulated community out there, give us a call. Appreciate you, Kelly, and John, and Laura for helping me out. And I'm sorry, I tell everybody it's not my favorite. Being in front of the camera is certainly not my favorite place to be. So you'll have to excuse the me saying basic probably 150 times during the presentation. But thanks again.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you so much for stepping in last minute and being available to do this. So we really appreciate you taking the time.